So we'll go into the immigration detention building, and the side we're going in is representing women and children. So the administration building where women and children mostly spent their time was destroyed by fire. And so we've represented that experience here in the museum in these rooms. The room we're in right now is the sitting room, and this is where people would have had snacks in between meals. They would have had time to do sewing, needlework. This is a place where people also would have had some classes, very basic classes in learning English or getting assistance from the different organizations that helped here on Angel Island. The most well-known person that helped immigrants here is Catherine Maurer, and she worked with the Methodist Church as a deaconess to help especially women and children, but all the immigrants here. But for Korean immigrants, they had another advocate who was well known here named David Lee. And he was an interpreter here for a time, translating for immigrants that did not speak English for the entry hearing process. And he was also an advocate on behalf of the Korean National Association and helping provide resources to Korean immigrants that were coming through Angel Island. So as we look around the room, we can see the different areas represented where people might have been eating or playing games, anything to help pass the time. Now, most Korean immigrants that were here were only here for a short time, maybe a week or so. And many of them were just here for 1 or 2 days. The longest stays for Koreans are probably around 2 months. But we don't have a lot of information because there weren't very many Koreans that came through here. We think only about 1,000 Korean people passed through Angel Island in the years it was open between 1910 and 1940. So all the people that were detained on Angel Island were detained because their immigration was being questioned. For people that had an easy time immigrating, they were processed on the ship that brought them across the ocean and were often allowed to go directly into San Francisco. But as the port of entry for San Francisco, Angel Island was the place people were sent who were not immediately allowed to enter the country. So here you would be questioned, you would have a medical examination, and depending on how things went, that might extend your stay or it might make it a shorter stay if you were able to pass all of those tests. So many of the people detained here were detained because they didn't have proper paperwork, especially coming from Korea during the years of Japanese occupation. It was very difficult to come by a passport because it was being issued by the Japanese-run government, and they were reluctant to issue passports to people to leave the country. In the case of one family that we'll talk about in a moment, they waited 1 year for their passport and appropriate papers to come through, and were still detained when they got here. So this room is the space where we're representing the experience of women and children. You can see we have beds here, and this room was considered healthy for 25 to 30 people. In these rooms, typically would have 50 to 60 beds in them, 2 to 3 times what was considered healthy. And the conditions in the women's spaces in the administration building were similar. Spaces tend to have more beds than were really supposed to be in there because so many people were coming. Although for women, there were fewer women coming than men in general. Most of the Korean immigrants that came through here were male students coming to higher education. So we have beds representing the different groups. And as we go through, we have Russian, South Asian, Korean, Japanese, and Chinese, and we do have one original bed in this space. Most of the beds in the building are reproductions because the beds were removed after the end of the use of this building after World War II. So we based all these reproductions off this one historic bed that was left behind. And if you like, we can take a closer look. This is the original bed here, And you can see it's made of metal, and the exterior, basically what we would use as pipes today, and it's kind of a mesh that has some give, very thinly woven wire. In our reproductions, we weren't able to replicate this exactly, but they would have had a mattress, blanket, and pillow that were all issued to the immigrant while they were here. And for women and children, if you had small children, they would actually sleep in the bed with you. So this is not a very large bed. I'm a fairly tall person. Without my hat, I'm about 5 feet 10 inches. And when I hold this mattress up in front of me, it comes to just under my chin. So if you were a taller person or sharing this bed with your child, there would not have been a lot of space. Now these beds are modeled after what they had on the ships of the time, and that's why they're so compact. They basically use as little space as possible, and by having them stacked 3 high, they also were able to get more people into a smaller space. So we've come upstairs from where the women and children are represented to the area where the men were staying. Now this room, again, is a little bit of a construct for the museum. We have European and Asian men in this room. Those 2 groups of men would have been segregated from each other, and then there was a third category of segregation for Chinese people. So this room, because we've moved the women in, the men have had to kind of squish together in the museum, but here we have a representation of their experience. About the same as far as occupancy, 25 to 30 people would have been considered healthy for this space, but the number of beds was closer to 50 or 60. And there is the only Korean inscription on the walls of the building in this room. And if you'll follow me over to the column, I'll show you where that is. So there's writing all over the walls at the immigration barracks, and that is because people express themselves here. And this is graffiti. They weren't allowed to write on the walls, but because this graffiti is so old, we like it now. And so this is the only Korean inscription here on this column, and it's actually a name and date. So many of the inscriptions in the building that were written by Chinese immigrants are in the form of poetry. And we do have some Korean poems that were written inspired by people's stays here that were published in Korean language newspapers of the time. And I would love to read you one of those poems, at least the English translation of it. So this was originally published by the San Francisco-based Shinhan Minbao newspaper. Mr. Choi's poem was published on April 25th, 1925, and the English translation was done by a translator here in the United States. So, A Night at the Immigration Station by Choi Kyung-sik. Why are my hands exhausted by crossing a vast ocean, now holding iron bars? The rain cries out and wakes me up because it pities me. Angel Island sleeping tight, no matter whether you hear this song or not. It is the complaint of a foreign guest whose whole heart is burning. Even though it said America is wonderful, how pathetic it has made me. If my mother knew about this, how shocked she would be. This border created by rascals, when can it be broken? I hope people all over the world will become brothers soon. April 3rd, written on a rainy night at the immigration station on Angel Island, San Francisco, America. Now, he was actually a student when he was here, and that's how most Korean immigrants were able to enter the country. And he went on to school, but unfortunately lived a very short life, dying in his 20s. But he is one of the few stories of Korean immigration here on Angel Island. It's a beautiful poem, beautiful sentiment. It could have been written today. So this is a poem written in Chinese on the walls of the barracks, and the poetry here actually helped save this building from being destroyed. This building and this entire site were going to be leveled and turned into camping and picnic areas in the late 1960s. And so a staff person, a ranger, came through. His name was Alexander Weiss. He was curious about the writing in the building and started talking to people about it in San Francisco. And some of those people were students. They came out here on kind of informal field trips. Those college students went home to their parents and said, I went to this amazing place called Angel Island. And many of their parents responded by saying, I was there. And it was the first time they'd ever talked about being detained on Angel Island. So that became a movement to save this building and the story here. And that's why we really appreciate these poems that are written on the walls, because they help save this building. Now this poem is actually two poems that go together. So it says, detained in this wooden house for several tens of days. It is all because of the Mexican exclusion law which implicates me. It's a pity heroes have no way of exercising their prowess. I can only await the word so I can snap Zoo's whip. From now on, I am departing far from this building. All of my fellow villagers are rejoicing with me. Don't say that everything within is Western styled. Even if it is built of jade, it has turned into a cage. And the poems on the walls, in addition to helping save this building, tell us a great deal about the people who were here. There are poems about the long journey, the bad food in the dining hall, the medical exams, the entry hearings, the waiting. There are poems that are hopeful, there are poems that are sad, there are poems that are angry. And it helps us understand all the different emotions that people experienced while they were detained here. Now, I will point out that it has a South Korean flag. We have a bed here, very simple. Most people that were coming were not coming with a lot during this time because they were using all of their resources to get here. And that led to people being detained. If you arrived and didn't have a lot of money, that was actually a reason to be deported. The immigration officials in the United States called these people LPC, likely to become a public charge, meaning they thought they were so poor that the government would eventually have to take care of them. So if you could prove that you were a student or that you had some sort of income, that would actually help your case in being allowed to enter. And again, that's where these advocacy groups like the Korean National Association and the Korean Methodist Church made huge differences in the ability of people to come in or to be deported. Ultimately, less than 5% of Koreans that came through Angel Island were deported and sent back to the countries of origin. Now, all of them were not sent back to Korea. There were at least a few that had traveled from Mexico on their way to Hawaii, but that ship stopped here in San Francisco, and there was a law that wouldn't allow you to pass through. If you couldn't pass through the port, you couldn't keep going on your journey, even if this wasn't your destination. So they failed the entry hearing, they were deported and actually sent back to Mexico instead of onto Hawaii where they were trying to go.